very much for being here. Just so you know, I'm Deborah Goodwin. I'm a retired associate professor of religion. And my major scholarly area was in the history of the Jewish and Christian encounter. I wrote my dissertation on a medieval Christian figure who actually interacted with Jewish scriptures and Jewish people in a respectful way. This was a novelty, as you might imagine. If you want to read the book, it's back there on the table. So that's where I come from a historical perspective myself. Before we go too deeply into this, I'd like to cover a few definitions of words that I will be using that it's helpful for people to distinguish. First of all, I'm talking about anti-Judaism in the Christian tradition. That is to say, antipathy, hatred, contempt expressed toward Jews as religious people, contempt for their religion, for Judaism itself. This is distinguishable from anti-Semitism, antipathy or hatred or contempt expressed toward Jewish people on the false basis of the false category called race. There basically is no such thing as race. Genetically, we're all largely identical. And race was the invention of racists to put people in categories and to create places where the white race would always be superior. You'll notice that there's no capital S in anti-Semitism. This is kind of a modern movement towards saying, you know, we're not going to dignify this with a capital. It's a made-up thing, and we're going to signal that it's a made-up thing. The significance of racial anti-Semitism is that people could convert to Christianity and still, in the eyes of the Nazi regime, be perceived as Jewish. This meant, depending upon how many Jewish ancestors they had, they were eligible to be transported and killed in the death camps. They simply weren't Christian enough to escape the racial categorization. The last thing is the Shoah. This is the Hebrew word for the whirlwind, for the destruction, for the murder of one Jew after another until more than 6 million were dead, which happened between 1939 and 1945, although actually quite a lot of killing started in 1935 too. This is a rally in Germany, attended, as you'll see, by prominent Christian theologians. One of them is a Catholic abbot, and the other one is a Lutheran bishop. And one of the things that I want to talk about is the relationship of Christianity and its anti-Judaism, of its contempt for the Jewish religion, to the political, secular anti-Semitism that lived throughout Europe and throughout the United States in the late 19th and 20th centuries. The Germans did not corner the market on this. So by showing this slide, I'm not proposing to suggest that Christian anti-Judaism caused the Shoah. There's no single cause really of any historical event, but it was certainly among the causes, and both theologians and historians today agree that it was a necessary, though not sufficient, cause. It helped to create the conditions that made it possible for ordinary people in Germany, in Poland, in Lithuania, the Balkan states generally, in Russia, to believe that eliminating the Jews from their community was a reasonable and even desirable thing. Here are a few correctives to what I regard as popular myths about the sources of the destruction of the Jews. First of all, popularly, at least when I was growing up, in elementary school and junior high or wherever, I was taught that, well, you know, the Holocaust, as we called it then, was caused by the Nazis. It was those crazy people. It was Adolf Hitler and his handful of henchmen who did this. Nah, not so much, I'm sorry to say. The vast majority of people in Germany were Lutheran or Catholic. The Jews were a minority. The vast majority of functionaries who processed people for transportation to the death camps were Lutherans or Catholics. In the early days of Nazism, when the government was pursuing a policy of either euthanasia or forced sterilization for people it regarded as inferior, those operations could be carried out at Catholic hospitals under specific rules that were supposed to protect the consciences of Catholics. But those Catholics rather quickly lost their conscience and proceeded to carry out the operations regardless. Similarly, it's been well documented, there are 2 good books on this topic, that police reservists, not regular army, were among the people who were sent to, especially Eastern Europe, to Lithuania, Latvia, those regions, Ukraine, as operatives who carried out mass murder. These were the Einsatzgruppen. And in the early days of the final solution, as it's called, the technique was to empty a community of its Jewish people, have them march out somewhere on the outskirts of the town, dig a large trench, strip off their clothing, and then be shot to death. This work was done by people who served in the police reserves, for instance, as well as regular troops. Those men went home on the weekends. They very likely went to church, and apparently experienced no conflict of conscience. If they did, they could opt out. They could say to their commanding officer, I don't want to do this. And there was no, famous thing. Yeah. Okay, here we go. There was no coercion. No, let's try number 7. I guess last time it was. Oh, here we go. It's back and forth. I'll just shake it around. Okay. In any event, people weren't punished for opting out. Again, another myth as well. This was a coercive police state. Everybody had to do what they were told. No, this was the Nazi Party was elected to power. Hitler prevailed in a democratic election. Okay, this is very important to bear in mind. Somebody had to type all of those lists of people to be transported. They were ordinary people who would wake up the next morning and realize their neighbors weren't there. Okay, so this is painful, but it's important to understand some of the myths that we tell ourselves to insulate ourselves from what actually happened. When did Christians begin to realize this? Painfully late. Painfully late. One of the early instances of recognition came in 1947 at a conference in Switzerland attended by Jules Isaac. He's the man on the left. Isaac was a very prominent French historian, a Jew. His wife and his daughter were murdered at Auschwitz. Isaac happened to be out on a walk when they were arrested and removed from their home, where they had been hiding. Even during the war, while his children and his wife were in the death camps, he began writing about the history of the relationship of Christianity and Judaism. His wife wrote to him from the camp and encouraged him to continue that work. After the war, he promoted dialogue with Christians in an attempt to battle against anti-Semitism, which in France was extremely strong. In 1960, at the age of 83, he met with Pope John the 23rd. That's the chappie on the right. Isaac shared with Pope John the outline of what would become his final book, L'enseignement du mépris, the teaching of contempt, a history of Christian anti-Judaism, the Christian roots of anti-Semitism. As he was leaving his Vatican audience, he said to the Pope, "Can I carry away a bit of hope?" And Pope John said, "You have a right to much more than hope." Pope John at that point was in the process of planning the Second Vatican Council, probably the greatest religious event of the 20th century, the most revolutionary event. And he directed his planners, his reluctant planners, to address the issue of historical anti-Judaism in the Catholic tradition. One of the very last major documents that the council issued was Nostra Aetate, in our age. And it was the first document issued by any Christian denomination to renounce its historical contempt for the Jews. And Nostra Aetate basically launched the careers of many people, myself included, who ended up studying in this field. And it also launched a period of serious re-examination on the part of many Christian denominations into the history of the church, into biblical interpretation, into the reflexes that give rise to anti-Judaism. The question that remains from 1965 onward is how much of this actually gets to the pews? I'm going to leave that question out there, hanging out there, along with the passage from Numbers for a little while, if I may. Any questions to this point? Those of you who know me know all you need to do is wind me up and watch me go, and off I go. So,
what was the role of the Vatican during the Nazi time?
You've asked one of the hot button questions, of course. Pope Pius XII, who was Pope during the Second World War, had previously been the Vatican's ambassador to Germany. He knew Germans and knew Germany well. One of his major concerns, both while he was Vatican ambassador and then subsequently as Pope, was the issue of the rise of communism. And in many respects, institutional Catholicism was more worried about the rise of communism than it was about the rise of right-wing authoritarian movements like Nazism and fascism. And insofar as that they saw those movements as effective bulwarks against the spread of communism, they were willing to kind of disregard some things. The record from the Vatican itself is very mixed. The kind of pious Catholic version is to say, well, the Pope did what he could. It's difficult to say that the Pope did all that he could. You could tar the United States with exactly the same brush. You could tar a lot of people with that brush. So the documents from that period are slowly being released. They've kind of outgrown their 50 or 75 year quarantine, and scholars are digging into the Vatican archives that they didn't previously have access to. So where does all this stuff come from? It's 2,000 years of softening of the consciences of Christians. Here's a famous passage that we don't often hear in church because who wants to preach on it? Just have to say, I'm looking at you, Jane. This is from the 23rd chapter of Matthew, discussing anti-Judaism and Christian origins. Really has to involve passages like this. Where Jesus says to the crowd and his disciples that the Pharisees are hypocrites, that the Pharisees are whitewashed tombs, on the outside looking beautiful, but inside they are full of the bones of the dead. You are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. What's significant here is the date up above there, next to the Gospel of Matthew. This document was probably accumulated from a variety of sources by about the year 85 of the Common Era. At that point, there were no Christians. There were only Jewish followers of Jesus and other Jewish adherents of other perspectives. In a sense, what's going on in the Gospel of Matthew could be described as a kind of sibling rivalry. This is a document assembled by one group of Jews trying to gain some leverage on the other group of Jews by using the oldest trick in the religious book, which is to call someone a hypocrite. Okay? By the year 85, the temple at Jerusalem had been destroyed for about 15 years. The Romans razed it in the year 70. There were only two Jewish groups that actually survived the destruction of the temple, that survived the destruction of the ritual center of Judaism. One of them was the Pharisees, and one of them was the followers of Jesus. They both survived because they were remarkably similar, and they did remarkably similar things. Both of them pored over the Hebrew Bible, studied it and reflected upon it and wrote about it. The Pharisees ultimately issued a series of documents we come to know now as the Mishnah, predecessor to the Talmud. The followers of Jesus issued a series of documents that we now call the New or Christian Testament. The New Testament is an extended commentary on the Hebrew Bible by people who had a particular perspective on both of those events, the event of the Hebrew Bible and the event of Jesus of Nazareth. Both of them were geniuses insofar as they were able to convert the fixed practices at the temple into metaphors to elevate sacrifice into praise and thanksgiving rather than anything physical, to practice study as a form of sacrifice. This made Judaism, either Pharisaic Judaism or Jesus of Nazareth style Judaism, into something eminently portable. Consequence? They're fighting for market share. This is Coke versus Pepsi. This is, I mean, for all their worst these days, which is to say absolutely nothing. This is the Yankees versus the Red Sox. This is, and since I have a microphone, this is Beyonce versus Taylor Swift. I mean, this is all about market share at this stage of sibling rivalry. Neither of these groups was dominant in the surrounding society. And in particular, the Christians, that is to say, the followers of Jesus, were quite a small group. And probably their rhetoric is even more hyped up as a consequence. But when the Jesus movement gains traction among non-Jews, when it gains traction among the people known as the Gentiles, we see a shift. The Gospel of John is later. It's certainly no earlier than 100, probably 125. It's a late document. There's a more explicit division between the two sets of people, and with it we see very explicit language. You are from the Father. You are from your father, the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth. Only in the Gospel of John are the rivals of the Jesus movement referred to as Jews. Only there. Now, people have asked, well, does any of this matter? I mean, historically, does this matter? I mean, does anybody actually think that the Pharisees are somehow equatable to modern-day Jews? Well, yes, of course. I was teaching out in the Midwest when I learned about this camp song, I Don't Want to Be a Pharisee. Yeah, I don't want to be a Pharisee, don't want to be a Pharisee. There are more verses. I don't want to be a Sadducee. And they're all Jewish groups from the New Testament. This was revelatory to me. I never went to camp and I didn't know about these things. But here's a columnist in a journal called Koinonia, an online journal, who says that this song has a serious truth. And the journal opted to illustrate it with a picture of a Hasid praying at the wall in Jerusalem. So surely there's continuity, right? Surely those Hasidim must be the same thing as a Pharaoh from whatever. And by the way, they're spiritually elitist. They viewed themselves as superior. These are all of the old canard, recycled again and again and again. Some of the other familiar things that we probably have all heard and may have uttered. By the way, Christians will say, we're spiritual, we're not literal. We believe in love and freedom, not law or restriction. We believe in a God of love, not a God of wrath. We make statements like, I really don't like the Old Testament, I prefer the Gospels. Notwithstanding, physically, Hebrew Bible, New Testament. Or we ask questions like, how are the Jews still waiting for a political Messiah? Didn't they reject Jesus because he was not a successful military leader? And doesn't the Bible tell us that the Jews were the enemies of Jesus? And didn't they plot his death? And that's how we get to places like this. And that's where we get to from places like this. So then the question is, did Jesus actually say, and did Jesus actually mean these things? It's highly doubtful. The Gospels are not journalism. The Gospels are not biographies. The Gospels are theological documents with agendas. They were all of them written at least a generation, maybe more, used typically, after the death of Jesus, each in a different place, by people who had had very different experiences of Jesus' life, teaching, death, resurrection. And they had different agendas vis-a-vis the world around them. They have created a literary character called Jesus, and they have given him words to say. No one can verify what Jesus actually said. The test of authenticity that scholars use is to say, if there is a speech or an action that's used in multiple places, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we're reasonably sure Jesus would have said that. But if something's a one-off, like Matthew 23, like John 8, it's highly likely that Jesus did not say these things or do these things. Of course, we don't have just the Bible to work with in terms of the tributaries to anti-Judaism and the Christian tradition. We have something that, this is kind of a technical term, you don't hear this typically in daily life, a concept that theologians refer to as supersessionism. Fortunately, thank you, Andre, I was reminded of what we could actually call this. It's a replacement theory. Owned and celebrated by Christianity. We are the new Israel. We are the true Israel. That old Israel forfeited their place in God's favor by rejecting Jesus, by supposedly plotting to kill him. God exercised divine judgment on them by destroying the temple, and then subsequently, a generation later, raising the city of Jerusalem. It's got nothing to do with the Roman Empire or its dynastic and militaristic aims. No, this is divine punishment. Therefore, we can safely assert that God's favor now rests on us. We are the chosen people. The early church had a problem, though. One of the very first heresies, to use a technical term for it, was the heresy of one named Marcion, who was active around the year 160 or so. And Marcion came up with a beautifully simple and elegant suggestion. He said, this is just full of stuff I don't like. So Marcion said, let's get rid of the Hebrew Bible. We don't need it. In Marcion's view, all Christians needed was a carefully expurgated version of the Gospel of Luke, some of Paul's letters, and that was basically it. Just expurgate any reference to Jews, Judaism, the old way, whatever. We don't need it. But very interestingly, the early church said, no, we do need it. We do affirm that the Hebrew Bible is a record of God's work for human beings toward their salvation and healing. We affirm this. We will hold on to it. Unfortunately, that insight of everything that the Hebrew Bible has to offer Christianity tends to get narrowed down in terms of saying, well, basically what happens here is fulfilled over here. In and of itself, it has no particular reality or purchase or grip. It's the fulfillment that matters. And then the other thing that was cooked up by my very close personal friend, Augustine, St. Augustine of Hippo, is to make the argument that the Jews are an important witness to the truth of Christianity, insofar as they suffer. Insofar as they do not prosper, that demonstrates that they are still rejected and reprobate. They witness then to God's justice. God has punished the people who have done God's will. And, sorry, that got a little bit too close, that was too Beyonce. Going along with all of this is the argument, the continuing argument that the Jews are blind to the meaning of their own scripture. The word for blind in Latin is caecus, C-A-E-C-U-S, caecus. I think some of us might hear a modern slur. Okay? And they have to be blind because Christ is the key to the scriptures. Christ is the key to valid interpretation, and they don't have Christ. Therefore, whatever they're doing is irrelevant. Whatever they're doing, said Augustine, is simply to remain stationary in useless antiquity. By the medieval period, when Christians began encountering Jews in Europe, they began to think, oh, well, they're stationary in useless antiquity. How helpful. Let's go ask them what this thing means in the Hebrew Bible. They treated them, as one scholar said, as a telephone to God, as though they did not have any kind of living tradition of their own or any real relationship to God. Supersessionism has served the Christian tradition for nearly 2,000 years. It has helped maintain a wall between Christianity and a living, breathing, vital Judaism. When Christians have encountered real Judaism, they have typically been puzzled, amazed, occasionally edified, and usually rattled. Because the latent question here is, if we are right, why are they still here? Why have they failed to see and embrace the truth that we assert is the one truth and the one way? There's a substantial amount of cognitive dissonance that sets in for Christian writers when they encounter a living, vital Judaism. Because on some level it shouldn't be. Nevertheless, this kind of what I regard as the odious witness teaching of Augustine did work to preserve Jewish existence. It made Christianity a less dangerous enemy than the later secular forms of anti-Semitism, such as Nazism, who could offer no justification for Jewish existence. As that quote from Hitler at the very beginning, there is one chosen people, and we are it. Questions? Comments? Are we having fun yet?
Hitler didn't mean Christians. Hitler didn't mean Christians are the chosen people. He meant the German people.
Yes. And there's an argument to be made, and in fact, even Jewish writers will make it, that once Hitler had finished with Judaism, there's a hypothesis anyway that the Nazis would have turned their energies on the Christian population, except that the Nazis per se made up something like people who self-identified as Nazi. They were 2 to 3% of the population. They would never actually have been able to destroy all the Lutherans and Catholics in Germany, because who had up to that point been actively cooperating with the regime. I mean, yes, the Nazis were enemies of all form of religion, except their own twisted pagan stuff. But
Are you going to speak about the part of the Lutheran Church in Germany that did resist the professing church that Bonhoeffer was a part of?
I wasn't planning to, but you know me, I can talk about anything. Yes, they were extremely important. As Sarah points out, there was a resistance movement in the Lutheran Church quite early on. It was known as the Confessing Church. And their major argument, their theological argument, was the fact that the overwhelming majority of the Lutheran Church, who became a kind of wing of the government, if you will, agreed with the proposition that Jews who had converted to Christianity and had been baptized were still Jews. Again, a racial basis. And the Confessing Church regarded that assertion as anti-theological, anti-Christian. Baptism makes us new people in Christ. And so they felt that their Lutheran compatriots were traitors to an essential theological truth. In the early days of the Confessing Church, they were not at all concerned about the fate of Jews as Jews. It took them, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of the first, but it took them a good few years to recognize the import of the Nazi racial policies and what was happening to the Jewish people in Germany. So there was resistance, but it was small. There's a parallel to this situation. You will have heard perhaps of people called the righteous Gentiles, the people who were helpful, who hid people, who saved people, who smuggled people to safe places. There's a rather fascinating and depressing book by a sociologist who studied people in Poland who acted as righteous Gentiles. And what she discovered was that the majority of those people were not motivated by religion. The majority of those people weren't religious at all. Most of them were secular people. Most of them were people who themselves had been on the outsides of a dominant society, who themselves never fit in. And so for them, they had been practicing a kind of resistance to conformity all their lives. And so to resist conformity one more time and to save somebody who knocks at the door and says, I need help, wasn't, I don't want to say it's not a big deal, but to them it wasn't unusual. One of the great stories of resistance and saving of Jewish lives comes from France, southern France, from Le Chambon. And that was a community of people, an extraordinary community of people who were French Huguenots. They had experienced generations of persecution as Protestants in that Catholic country. They were already on the outside. And they didn't have a problem saying, of course we will help these people. There's a wonderful film about Le Chambon, which is now kind of hard to get. And there's one elderly woman, not well educated. She was a farm wife, but she was deeply faithful. And in the French interview and then in the subtitles, she speaks of the Jewish people as, well, we called them Old Testaments. It was kind of cool. Oh, I've got a few Old Testaments lying around. it was a way of expressing, but perfectly frank to say, of course we did this, without question. But it was their outsider status that seemed to drive an impulse to help other outsiders.
The church has a copy of that movie, I believe.
No!
What's it called?
It was shown here.
We should show it again. We should show it every year. It's called Weapons of the Spirit. And it's a documentary by a young man who was born in Le Chambon to two Jewish refugees who managed to escape. And he came to the United States and then he made the film. It's a wonderful film. I hope we have the full version up there, 2 versions. But anyway, sorry.
Picky, we go.
I know, picky.
It's hard to get to. Oh, I hope
And the food is miserable.
Thanks, Deborah. Just a quick one with the last 2 sub-bullets here. Is the validity, prophecy, fulfillment, is that an okay? I feel like we have sort of a good thing and a not so good thing. No.
I personally don't regard either of them as good. I mean, in the sense that, again, just talking about the Old Testament is only useful insofar as we validate it through fulfillment in the New Testament. Again, essentially removing its independent validity as a witness to God's action in the world. We reduce it to what's significant to us. Yeah. Thanks, David. So, again, has any of this historical reflection reached the pews? This is an ongoing problem in the church. Large-scale organizations, the Vatican, Second Vatican Council, or the General Convention, or any number of kind of big league operations will do wonderful things. They'll pass all kinds of statements about the environment, or about racism, or about anti-Semitism, and they tend to live there, somewhere up there or on the internet. And the question is, how do we get any of this down into the pews? And as I said, this activity of self-reflection, and it goes on in the scholarly world as a fashion. It's gone out of fashion now. People don't tend to write the kinds of books that I wrote, and theologians don't tend to reflect on this very much actively anymore. They've moved on to other things. There's creation care, there's anti-racism. There are fads in theology, let's face it. So these high-level teachings, these important documents like Nostra Aetate, tend to get ignored. They tend not to be translated into action in the pews. Here's another barrier. The Episcopal Church, in common with the Catholic Church and other churches, use a document that we call traditionally the lectionary. This is an ancient practice of assembling readings for every Sunday. There's a reading from the Old Testament, there's a psalm, there's a reading from the New Testament, a word from Paul, there's the gospel reading. These things are threaded together like beads on a wire to tell a certain kind of story. And the story, notwithstanding the fact that this selection for tomorrow is from the so-called Revised Common Lectionary, the story is still effectively a supersessionist story. Here's the story of Moses with the brazen serpent, as it was called back in the day. And then here's, what do we have over here? Well, we have Jesus talking to Nicodemus, conveniently enough a Pharisee, who comes to him by night because he's afraid. And then Jesus says, and just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Prophecy fulfillment. The story of whatever happened in the desert to the ancient Israelite people is insignificant, clearly, compared to what Jesus says about being lifted up as the source of salvation. So this is with us always, in a sense. There have been some attempts to further revise the Revised Common Lectionary, being attentive to these things, but it really hasn't got hold. I mean, it's a tremendous undertaking to do this. And so what we have to hope for is that we're going to have preaching that doesn't fall into kind of easy things. The other barrier to real change is people doing what is easy. Sorry, Andre has to preach tomorrow. Sorry, Dan. Right, really. The easiest thing of all that we fall into all the time is to listen to the gospel or to quote the gospel and say, this is what Jesus said. Assuming always what's in the gospel is what Jesus said. And then, of course, we only quote the parts that we like, that comfort us. This is what Jesus said. Right? And we often resist sermons or other forms of teaching that would suggest otherwise. I want to take us a layer below the literal to something about, well, what's the context of this having happened? Katie did this last week beautifully. In a sermon designed for children, she still was able to talk about the context of John's gospel and why violent anti-Jewish language was being used. But for the most part, we want to come to church and we want some comfort food. The world is a hard place. And it's difficult. It's difficult to preach this stuff and not get blowback. I understand for people who do it. There's the other easy thing here, second bullet. It's so easy to preach against hypocrisy. Again, the great religious crime, right? Legalism, hardness of heart. And even when it's us who are being accused, if we're being linked to hypocritical Pharisees by the preacher, we're still hearing the same thing. It's those people. It's those people. We shouldn't be like those people. I don't want to be a Pharisee. Another giving is blaming biblical Jews, quote unquote, for not accepting Jesus, assuming that we would somehow have been different. This is wonderful historical 2020 hindsight, that moral hindsight that I frequently practice. Well, I wouldn't have been one of those people. Of course I would have been one of those people.
I'm wondering, my elementary school was a Protestant school, and I remember being scared most of the time, because it was always about doom, and if I did something wrong, I was going to go straight to hell, and I was a naughty kid. So, but if you look back in history, Christianity was such a huge part of it, but also the fear that people had. And if you're fearful, you have to point at somebody so that you can blame them for the fear that you have. And I'm wondering if some of that has to do with us pointing to the first people that created Christianity.
Next to JUCO, Pam just whispered scapegoating. But yes, and I do this. I don't do it very frequently, but sometimes I'm tempted to watch television shows about hoarding, and so that I can look at somebody's interior and say, oh, at least my room doesn't look like that. It's that. Yeah, and a great deal of this was identity formation. We are not you. We are not you. We don't know precisely, and this was a big question for Christianity for centuries. We don't know precisely what we are, but we know we're not you. And so it is a kind of, I think, refuge, if you will. Yes, yes, yeah. Fear seems to be a recurring theme in these gatherings. It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, the us against them thing, rooted in fear, rooted in a desire to name ourselves as something distinctive, something better than, hopefully. It's very powerful, it's a powerful impulse, I think, especially when we read passages from the Hebrew Bible, especially if we read them in a kind of deracinated, segmented kind of way. There's no unrooted, sorry. I just did one of those stupid academic things. And what we lose sight of, you say, oh, these people, they're bad, they're spoiled, they're grumbling, they're impatient, they're violent, all these bad things that they do. We talked about it last week, about David and Moses, the flawed instruments of God, etc., etc. And we lose sight of the fact of who is telling us these stories. Who is telling us? Karen is smiling and nodding. Karen knows. Karen, tell us who is telling us these stories.
In the people who have a hidden agenda. Really?
That's not what I was hoping for. You did. What I was going to say, you can take me on, because you're more than capable. What I was going to say, the people who are telling us these stories are the people themselves. The ancient Israelites provided us with a national history that is so incredibly unflattering. I mean, can you imagine a history of the United States that would be like the Hebrew Bible? I mean, the self-reflection, the painful self-reflection that's basically there on every page. God made us to be good, God made us to be happy, God made us to be prosperous, and every single time God gives us an opportunity, we say, no, thanks, actually, I want to go over here and do this instead. They do this over and over again, and they tell the stories on themselves. Is that okay? Okay, she's nodding, yes, good. So the temptation to play us against them really does kind of block the capacity to see the text for what it is. Okay. It's also easy to assume that we aren't actually being conditioned by the 2,000 years of teaching, preaching, lectionary linking of chains. We have been conditioned. It's still there. You know, I've studied this stuff for decades, and I'm still kind of reflexively, in Judaism, it's hard to banish. And then the last easy thing that's particularly pertinent right now is to, in any way, confuse Judaism and Jewish values with the current activities of the Israeli government. They are not the same. They are not the same. All right, so what can we do? I argue, and I'm not alone, that Christianity without its Jewish roots and without a challenge from Judaism is deformed, impoverished, and false. We have to be its allies. We have to be its advocates. We have to recognize that just as in the 1930s, nationalism, authoritarianism, and anti-Semitism are a toxic stew that feed on one another. They're like bacteria in a toxic stew. They all go together. And in this case, going back to Sarah's point, it's very likely that indeed the stew would turn against people of faith in other religions, not just Judaism. But still we have to be their allies, because look at our past. I believe we have a historical debt. I was part of one of the Sacred Ground circles on anti-Semitism. I was a co-facilitator for that with Joanne Rosenthal from Beth Israel in Bath. And we talked a bit about the history in Christianity of anti-Judaism. And the Jewish people in the room had no idea what some of our Gospels say. I didn't even show them the worst parts. And I cannot tell you how grieved and sad and ashamed I was to see the expressions around me of people who looked like they were going to be physically ill when they knew that this was what Christianity said about them. We have an obligation to be allies. We have an obligation to be rooted in Judaism, to be rooted in this massive section of the Bible that's called the Old Testament, better to call it the Hebrew Bible, and to recognize that without the God of the Hebrew Bible, who was Jesus' only God, there would be no story of salvation. No Hebrew Bible, no Jesus. God's saving action begins in creation and carries on throughout the entirety of the document. It's not something special to us. The other thing that I think we really need to get on board with is allowing ourselves to be challenged more. I used to do this with my students, having them grasp the difference between orthopraxy and orthodoxy. Christianity from the late antique period has been very big on orthodoxy, correct teaching. I believe in God, the Father, the Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ. Only I can do it from memory. We say the words. And what words you're saying is very, very important. The early Greek name for the creed was symbolon, which was literally a symbol worn on one's clothing that would identify who you are. So being able to recite the creed is a way to identify that you're a Christian. Judaism has no creed. My dissertation director, may his memory be for a blessing, used to say, 2 Jews in a room, you come away with 5 opinions. This is not about belief. It's about right action. You don't believe things in order to be Jewish. You do things in order to be Jewish. And Christianity, especially, sort of funneled through rather deformed parts of Lutheranism and other places, walks away from the doing of things to say, oh, no, I'm saved by grace through faith. I don't actually have to do anything to be saved. And decentering the whole focus on salvation, first of all, would be really helpful. And then we could focus on responding truly to God by deeds. Or as St. Francis of Assisi supposedly said, preach the gospel every day, sometimes use words. We could challenge ourselves to find ways to act as Christians, and this came up last week with Andre, to act as Christians, specifically as Christians in the world. But we have to do the hard work of self-examination first. We have to do ethical analysis. We have to look at a contemporary issue in the face and then, okay, how do we sift through this as Christians and what's a Christian response? And we could do this as a community. Too often I think we kind of outsource our moral reflection. There's no reason why we shouldn't be doing it ourselves, just as Jewish people would be doing it. We need to study the Hebrew Bible. Just full stop. We need to study the Hebrew Bible. Don't rely on little snippets that you get in the lectionary. Read the Hebrew Bible intelligently. A wonderful guide, fabulous book, Getting Involved with God, Rediscovering the Old Testament by Ellen Davis, who's a Hebrew Bible scholar at Duke. Was before that was at Virginia Theological Seminary. It's a wonderful book because it teaches us as Christians how to think theologically with the Hebrew Bible, how to see that message of salvation everywhere throughout the Hebrew Bible. We could be doing this maybe instead of a Bible study. We've got a couple Bible study groups. I see 2 of the leaders here. This would be a different way of studying the Bible.
We have that in the library.
Yes, it's in the library. You want to read it? Yes. And actually, I got this deaccession copy at one of St. Paul's book sales. It was Marianne Hoy's. Yeah. Her name is in there. Yeah. So, in short, Take some responsibility. Read more, think more, question more. Remember the prayer, Eucharistic prayer C. Deliver me from the presumption of coming to this table for solace only and not for strength, for pardon only and not for renewal. Come for some meat and not just macaroni and cheese. And don't snark at your clergy when they want to give you some meat. Okay? And just keep challenging the lazy assumptions that people make all the time. Challenge them in Bible study. Challenge them from the pulpit. I have done both of those things. I have gotten to the point where I will not listen to anti-Jewish lazy preaching. I will get up and walk out. I have confronted people in the past, but now I just don't have the energy for it. Everybody should know better. But we do have to educate people, so go ahead and confront them. You can do it. I'll just walk out. Questions, reflections. We've got. There is something I would like you to do before we part, but I'd be very happy to entertain Dana Bear.
As a complete aside, I've often wondered if we called ourselves, I don't know, neo-Jews, or if we called ourselves the new Jewish movement or something like that, some of this stuff would have naturally atrophied on its own, but I don't have an answer to that. Here's my question, and this is I fully appreciate everything you said, but if you imagine there's a group of people that have a belief set, and then something happens, Jesus gets born, and some people accept the deity of Jesus and some people don't. Naturally, there's going to be some push and pull between those two factions of the same, factions of two religions that sit on the same foundation. So how do you, what's your perspective on managing that? Because it's a pretty fundamental issue. For me, it's not quite so challenging. I'm probably the most, maybe the least committed Christian in the room. So for me, that's not such a big problem. But for a lot of people, that's a real problem. And I just would like some perspective on that.
It's an excellent point, and it has to do in part, a way forward would have to do in part with shifting our focus. Going along with orthodoxy is this belief that Jesus Christ is the Savior and the only way. Very, very narrow Christological focus, a Christocentric focus, if you will. It is possible, and it's very, very readily could I validate this from the historical sources, it's possible to look at the movement of, some people call it the followers of the way or the followers of Jesus, to look at the Pharisees and to say, again, one of these things that the folks have in common is a goal. The common goal is unity with God and unity with what God calls us to be, the best of who we are meant to be. That's our goal. Both of them have a way to get there. The Pharisees have the Torah. They have the teaching. Some of you have heard me say this. They have the perhaps mythical 613 positive and negative commandments that correspond to the bones, sinews, and muscles of the human body. God's gracious gift to remake fallen human nature is the Torah. Who do Christians have? They have Jesus of Nazareth, who in a different way embodies the same divine will for people who follow that way. The end point is theocentric. It's going to God. It's not focusing about on the intermediary step, who is Jesus. That doesn't mean you have to have a debate over the Chalcedonian resolution of is Jesus God, is Jesus divine, how is that, whatever. No, you just say these are different ways, but the end point is the same. And it's defensible. I think it's defensible intellectually. I think it's defensible spiritually. And when you have conversations with living, breathing Jewish people, it becomes very rich as a possibility. We don't have to stay. Oh, it went away again. We don't have to stay in these silos. If we accept that the God of Abraham and Sarah is the God of Jesus Christ. That's my view. Maybe. You're nodding very nicely, Dana. I don't know if what I've said is remotely satisfying, but. Yes, Terry.
Not a question, but just a quick comment, and you'll see some of this in what I wrote for the meditation. I was not raised as an Episcopalian. I came to it. And when I was ready to be confirmed, thank you, Pam, we went on a retreat, and we had a wonderful priest in DC. There were about 12, 15 of us from, oh gosh, a dozen different things, including Dutch Reform and lots of, I don't know if there was a Jew there or not. But anyway, we went through this long weekend of the ethical analysis you're talking about. That's what we talked about. And at lunch on the last day, I said to the priest, so Bill, what do I need to do to get confirmed? He said, just one thing, accept Jesus Christ as your Savior. And it didn't occur to me then, what happened to all that ethical analysis we just went through? But it occurs to me now.
And the priest gave a perfectly legitimate answer. It's just too bad he didn't give it any context. What does it mean to accept Jesus as your Savior? Is it just verbal in a notional assent? Or does it mean to walk as a disciple? To walk as a disciple, to do as Jesus did. Yeah. Take the risks that Jesus took. Yeah. That's sad. Yeah. What happened to all that? Thank you, Terry.
I think maybe in the same vein as what Dana asked me. So can we have a both and? Should we attend synagogue? I think we're trying to get away from this cognitive dissonance that you mentioned earlier. I speak out of pure ignorance of the Jewish faith and little knowledge of the Christian faith, but can we, if we merge them both together, are we going to fight, or can we find common ground and come to the goal that you just mentioned of?
I'm not arguing for a merger. I mean, I think people are entitled to their religious traditions, but I think understanding Judaism will make us better Christians. I think understanding Christianity might make Jews better Jews. I won't speak for them, I'll only speak for myself. I will say this though, if you have never been to shul, if you have never been to synagogue, you should go. Things are very difficult these days. You would have to ask the permission of the rabbi, you would probably have to register your name and address. It's heartbreaking. We drive by Beth Israel on Saturday morning in Bath and there's a policeman outside. Okay? But if you have never gone to synagogue, you have missed one of the most joyful religious celebrations you're likely ever to experience. One of the most joyful that I was ever at was an Orthodox synagogue. It was actually, it's a long story, but it wasn't actually properly in a physical synagogue, but it was in a room that was configured as though it were, men on one side, women on the other. I have never heard so much love, so much gratitude, so much celebration of the goodness of God. That's what it was all about. And then I thought, well, maybe this is just this particular Torah portion that we're reading today. Maybe it's some. No, you keep going, and that's what you hear. You hear joy and gratitude. It's very edifying for Christians.
Deborah, my husband Charles, his father was Jewish, so I have many Jewish cousins by marriage. I've been to many bat mitzvahs, bar mitzvahs, and I agree with you 100%. I have a question about you're referencing the things in the New Testament that are against the Jews. Are they mainly against the leadership and not the Jews as a whole? And do we need to distinguish between that? Because the leadership, I think, was threatened by Jesus' popularity and did oppose him. But so I think some of the negativity was against the leaders, but not against the whole. Just like we have to distinguish between the Jewish government in Israel and the whole Jewish people.
Thank you, Sarah. That's an excellent point. It especially has come up in the study of the Gospel of John. That the opponents there are supposedly the leaders of, in this case, it would really be the leaders of the temple, the group that we typically know as the Sadducees. The Pharisees are often mistakenly identified as elitists or as leaders or anything else. They really weren't. They were kind of middle, if you will, middle-class Jewish people who studied the Torah very carefully, and who were actually opposed to the Sadducees on a number of levels. It's hard to say, however, if even on those grounds it's a fair criticism. It's important to note, of course, that under occupation, the only way the temple could operate would be if the temple leadership achieved some level of accommodation with the occupiers. They had to do that. They had to do that. So yes, they are maybe accurately portrayed as playing ball with the Romans to protect themselves, or maybe, again, it's just a kind of a convenient trope. It's very hard to know. The important thing to keep in mind is that when the temple was destroyed in the year 70 by the Roman army, all of the people, the priests, the so-called Sadducees, died defending it. Josephus, the later Jewish historian, tells us that the temple ran with their blood. So there was real devotion there that I don't think is fully captured in the New Testament record. So it's a grain of salt, but thank you. It's a wonderful question, very important. Very important. So I was wondering if you'd like to go to shul. Let's do some Torah study. Here's Numbers 21, 4 through 9 again. I'd like you just to kind of form up in little groups and go over your reactions. You had an initial reaction probably when you read it at the beginning of our time.